name is Victoria Findlay Wolfe. I am a quilter, author, teacher, and all-around double wedding ring obsessed quilt maker. I wanted to share some secrets to the way that I get from a traditional pattern to a modern design. A few weeks ago, I showed you a few tricks that I use in looking at leftover blocks that I've made or leftover quilt tops and using my die cutting machine to be able to change the information that's happening. But I really wanted to give you some examples of how I get from A to Z in my design process. So one of the ways that I start is I talk about having a parts department. I don't like to spend a whole lot of time quilting or cutting per se. I want to be able to have my pieces ready to go and get them up on the design wall so that I can push them around. So here in front of me we have some of the parts that I've already cut out of one of my double wedding ring quilts. So when I talk about taking baby steps in my process, it's starting with some small pieces, building some segments. Here I've made some small melons of the double wedding ring. And then I'm building those really by just focusing on one small part of the process. I'm not thinking about the whole general overview of what the quilt is ultimately going to look like. So after I have some of my little morsels already sewn together, I'm going to bring them to my design wall and I'm going to lay them out. I don't need to jump too far ahead in my process. I just need to make the parts to get myself to an interesting position. Another way that I can look at these is by taking my scraps and deconstruct the double wedding ring itself. Taking just a single part of it is a good lead into making a modern quilt. So now I'm just using one single ring of a double wedding ring, placing it on some of my scraps, and I could build an entire quilt just on that segment. Okay? Let's look at this next one. This is one of the traditional blocks. Ultimately, this quilt has a very modern feel, but let's take a look at the pieces just to see what it actually looks like before I drop in that negative space. I have my multiple layers already lying on my die. I'm going to run this through the machine. So here we can see I have a traditional partial seam block. By using all of the different colors, I can see that I could have a very heavy traditional feel, but by taking some of the color out of the story, when we're looking at it here, you're now getting a completely different interpretation of that block. Sometimes when I'm making a quilt, I'm just going to look for whatever I have on hand without having to go purchase something. So I happen to have a layer cake here that had tonal values. This is a very good way to try to push yourself outside of your creative box by just using a set amount of different colors of fabrics. So what looks like a very traditional block at the start, by laying out the pieces in those shapes and deciding how am I going to fill those colors, and using a limited palette, I had to make that work, and using those two values really gave this quilt a powerful punch. This next quilt is just using a mini wave. It's a tiny little curved shape. Initially, it was designed to just play with color placement. Here I cut a whole stack of just random solid colors out. And again, when I'm looking at the patterns that are laying there in front of me, I want to know what else I can do with those pieces. So I could either lie them all up into columns, or I could flip-flop them and now be playing with some curves to give some other interesting shapes going on in one pattern. Or pulling them out all together and adding in the little strip in the inside, I now have a very sweet baby quilt. So using the die cutting can really help you bust through a lot of different scraps. So laying my scraps on the die, cutting out multiple pieces, and using all of my bright, happy colors and some solids gives me a very fun table runner. Or I could make strips and strips of these and just make a big, beautiful scrap quilt. This next quilt is using two separate shapes that come on one die. So I have a half a parallelogram and I have a full parallelogram. But by putting all of those pieces up on my design wall, it becomes about pushing color around, looking for a light value and a dark value. So here my light pink is acting as my light, and this dark burgundy is acting as my dark. That's the thing when you're using a lot of different colors within one quilt pattern, that you're going to get depth and you're going to get movement. So this quilt really sings by having a lot of different values going on, but I can also calm it down by dropping in the parallelogram of some solid colors just to give you a resting place within the quilt. Another way that you can approach this is by using your scraps, sewing random pieces of scraps together, which is what I do every time that I come into the studio, and be able to make a piece of fabric, which I consider to be, you're kind of like being a fabric designer. You're putting a lot of random colors together, which you can then cut that piece of fabric apart. So the pillow behind me shows that very well, where I'm using a very traditional pattern of a bow tie block, using my scraps as the filler space, and then you can see that I can use just about every single color that I have and make a good story out of it. What you're seeing there then is that the lights, the yellows, the darks, the navy blues, and the blacks are giving a lot of movement within those spaces, but it gives you something that's a little bit more interesting than you might not have initially set out to do. Instead of cutting one piece of fabric, I'm using 50 different pieces of fabric. So the most important thing that I want you to remember when you're working this way is that you cannot make a mistake. We all like to hear that, right? So when you have a multiple pile of scraps in color, particularly on this quilt where you're using a lot of different colors, it's all about pushing the color around until you're happy with the way that it looks. Okay, let's look at the next quilt. I mentioned earlier on one of the quilts about sometimes when I make a quilt that I'm only using a limited amount of fabric. That's a very good challenge because you have set parameters and you have to decide how am I going to make something that looks pleasing to my eye. So in this particular quilt, all of the printed fabrics were fabrics that I purchased while I was teaching in Japan. And I came back and I wanted to make all of those fabrics live together, even though they were purchased completely random, all to live nicely within one quilt. Then by taking just a solid, which is a nice way to incorporate modern looks into your quilts, I used 3 different colors and being able to break up a traditional block, which has the quarter arc inside it, where I could just sew those all together, which is going to give me a full circle, or I can bust them apart, add in some easy sashing, drop in some little highlights, a little shot of yellow in the inside never hurts, and then playing with how the fabric is landing behind the shapes. Often we are focused on dealing with the specific look that the block needs to be. So like if you were doing a shoe fly block, you want to put the color in the shoe fly pattern. But one thing I try not to forget is to look at the background fabric. What can I put into the background fabric that's going to allow me to have even more pattern to the quilt that you might not initially have seen? So by doing this, by changing the values around the outside of the quilt, I'm now not just making a pattern with the circle, but I'm making a secondary pattern that's going to happen behind the block. So I'm looking at the fabrics that want to tell the biggest story, the ones that are talking the loudest. Where am I going to put them in the quilt so that I get an overall pleasing effect? Coming back to the edges of the quilt, sometimes I'm focused all on just the inside, but sometimes I need to focus on the outside edge of the quilt. So on this one, deciding to not leave a square edge and just dropping in my quarter circle out into my sashing gives me a perfect rounded edge, and sometimes that's all about just looking at the pattern itself and deciding how can I break it down and move those parts and pieces around. Surprisingly, this quilt is made by using the same die. You have often multiple choices that you can use within one pattern. Here, instead of a solid arc, I'm getting to use my points here and also put in some pie pieces that are going to fill on in the inside. Taking it down to a 2-color quilt gives it a total modern look. I have so much fun playing with the varieties of these, but remember to think about those pattern shapes as just a coloring book page. How am I going to fill those shapes rather with color to be able to tell a really powerful story? So I hope that you're going to have as much fun playing with these variety of shapes, but give yourself the courage to be able to stop and look at those and cut up that fabric, because I know you have more, and come up with some really beautiful and unique designs for yourself.